If anyone had told me I'd spend the twilight of my life standing outside a hotel suite, clutching a folder full of proof, I would have called them dramatic. But that was before I learned that betrayal doesn't care about your age. It doesn't care how many years you've given, how many sacrifices you've made, or how many Sunday mornings you spent making someone else's life easier. Betrayal just arrives, sudden and obscene, like a door you forgot to lock. I was 65 the day I stood in that hallway. 65, with hair silvered at the temples and hands that had folded his shirts for more than 3 decades. My name is Eleanor Hart, though for most of my adult life, I was just Eleanor, his wife. The woman who knew how he liked his coffee, who remembered the names of all the men at his firm, who kept our household running so smoothly he never noticed it at all. I suppose that was the first warning sign. When you become invisible to someone, it's only a matter of time before they decide you don't exist. I shifted the folder against my hip, feeling the edges dig into my palm. Inside was everything. The bank statements showing where he'd siphoned money from our retirement fund, the receipts from this hotel suite he called his private retreat, the notarized divorce papers, and a signed affidavit from our lawyer confirming that every dollar he spent here belonged to us both. Behind me, 2 uniformed officers waited patiently, their presence a quiet kind of assurance that this time, finally, he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of the truth. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. I thought I'd be shaking, but the only thing I felt was a hollow steadiness, like I'd stepped out of my own body and was watching it all unfold from a place just above my shoulder. There was a time I would have cried. There was a time I would have begged him to explain, to tell me it was all a misunderstanding, that the woman I'd seen in those hotel records was a colleague, a client, a friend. That time had passed. I looked at the gleaming brass numbers on the door, Suite 1902, and tried to remember the last time I'd stayed in a hotel this nice. It had been years, maybe longer. We were supposed to take a trip to Charleston for our 40th anniversary, but he canceled at the last minute, citing work. He'd kissed me on the cheek, said, "Next year, Ellie," and I'd believed him because belief was easier than suspicion. Because love, real or imagined, makes you complicit in your own erasure. I glanced at the young concierge standing awkwardly down the hall. She looked nervous, like she'd wandered into something private. She probably thought I was here for a reconciliation. The notion almost made me laugh. No, this wasn't a reunion. This was a reckoning. The lead officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, whenever you're ready." I nodded, feeling the cool air from the corridor swirl around my ankles. I adjusted the sleeve of my black dress, the same one I'd worn to my sister's funeral. It felt appropriate. After all, I was here to bury something, the last illusions I had about the man waiting on the other side of this door. When I raised my hand to knock, I caught a glimpse of it, lined, steady, marked by time and work and years of devotion he'd taken for granted. It was the hand that had nursed him through surgeries, that had written checks to keep our life afloat, that had pressed against the small of his back in crowds to remind him he wasn't alone. And now it was the hand that would end all of it. I didn't feel old in that moment. I didn't feel weak. I felt like something elemental, something inevitable, the consequence he never imagined would come for him. I knocked 3 times, firm, unhurried. For a moment, the laughter inside went quiet. I heard the hush of a woman's voice, then the familiar cadence of his, lowered to a tone I once mistook for tenderness. My stomach didn't twist. My eyes didn't burn. I had already spent every tear I'd ever give him. All that remained now was this: truth, dressed in black, standing on his doorstep. The door handle turned, and everything I'd once built with him, every promise, every shared account, every evening I waited alone, balanced on the edge of what came next. The door swung open, slow, like he thought he could control the pace of what was about to happen. For a second, I took in the absurdity of it all. My husband standing there in a hotel bathrobe he didn't own, his hair still damp from a shower, the kind he never took at home because there was never time. And behind him, blurred in my periphery, was the silhouette of a woman, half hidden by the suite's wide doorway. She moved, uncertain, her voice soft and questioning. "Who is it?" I didn't look at her. Not yet. My gaze stayed fixed on him. Thomas Hart, 68 years old, the man I'd married when we were both too young to know the price of compromise. The man I'd buried my own ambitions for. The man who had once pressed my hand to his chest and said, "You're my whole future." He tried to smile, but his mouth couldn't quite remember how. "Ellie," he started, using the nickname he hadn't said with warmth in over a decade. "What are you, I held up a hand. It was astonishing how easily the old reflex, listen, nod, forgive, tried to crawl back. But something inside me had finally sealed shut. "I wouldn't finish that sentence," I said, voice steady, quiet. "Not unless you want to lie in front of witnesses." His eyes flicked past me, registering the officers in the hall. His pupils shrank. For all his practiced charm, he'd never been good at hiding fear. He swallowed, shifting his weight like a boy caught cheating a test. "Ellie, please, this isn't—" I lifted the folder, resting it gently on my palm as though it were something delicate instead of the blunt instrument it was. "This is exactly what it looks like," I said. I stepped past him, feeling the air conditioning rush over my skin. Inside, the suite was too bright. Overhead lights turned up to maximum, illuminating the glossy marble floors, the champagne on ice, the two flutes sweating condensation on the coffee table. The woman, young, no older than 35, clutched the collar of a silk robe around her throat. She looked at me like I was a nightmare she'd only half believed was real. Maybe she thought I'd scream, throw something, collapse in a heap. But grief had already finished its work on me. What was left was clarity. I set the folder on the glass table with a soft, final sound. The woman started to speak, but I cut her a glance so cold and precise she closed her mouth. I turned to Thomas. I wanted to feel rage. I wanted to feel pity. But I felt nothing at all. Like a house after a fire. Only the frame remained. "Let's not waste time," I said. "These are the documents proving you withdrew over $160,000 from our joint accounts. Here are the transactions from this hotel, the necklace you bought her." I inclined my head toward the woman without really seeing her. "The flight bookings." He lifted a hand, palm out, like he thought he could slow the flood of consequence. "I can explain." I smiled, small and humorless. "That's the thing, Tom. You've been explaining for years, explaining why you were late, why the money was tight, why you needed space. I don't need another explanation. I need accountability." I turned to the officers, feeling their presence anchor me in the moment. "Gentlemen, as discussed, this is a formal complaint for misappropriation of marital funds and fraud. My attorney has prepared statements and will be following up." The younger officer nodded. "Professional, but not unkind. We'll need to ask you both a few questions, ma'am, but you can proceed." Tom looked pale, the robe slipping off one shoulder. It was strange seeing him vulnerable, not in the way he'd been when his father died or when he'd lost his job 10 years ago and I'd held him through the nights. This was different. This was the vulnerability of a man who finally understood there was no lie left big enough to cover the truth. I took a breath, slow and steady, tasting the sterile air of that suite. I'd wondered for days how this moment would feel, whether it would make me sick or triumphant or shattered. But it felt like something simpler, like stepping out of a room that had been suffocating me for years. I met his eyes. "You don't get to decide what this is," I said, voice low. "You've decided enough." And before he could gather the courage to speak again, I turned away, feeling something unburden itself in my chest, something old and tired finally releasing its hold. The room had fallen so still it felt like the suite itself was holding its breath. I could see her reflection in the mirrored wall behind the sofa. This woman in the silk robe, clutching her own elbows like she could shrink herself small enough to disappear. She looked at me, then at him, her eyes darting as though she was calculating how fast she could run. I didn't look back at her. I wasn't here for her. She was just the newest recipient of his compulsive need for novelty, the inevitable byproduct of a man who believed that comfort was a synonym for ownership. No, I was here for him and for myself. One of the officers shifted politely, clearing his throat as he pulled a small notebook from his jacket. "Ma'am, for the record, can you confirm your identity?" I turned fully toward him, shoulders squared. "Eleanor Hart," I said, voice clear. "Wife of Thomas Hart, joint account holder on all assets in question." I heard Tom exhale, a soft, defeated sound. It struck me, absurdly, that this was the first time in years he'd listened to me without interruption, without half his mind on a phone screen, a news broadcast, a spreadsheet. For a flicker of a second, I wondered if this was what it had taken all along, complete ruin, to command his undivided attention. The officer nodded, jotting notes. "And can you confirm the nature of your complaint today?" I didn't look at Tom. I looked at the young woman, who was trying very hard not to cry. For once, my voice didn't waver. "I am filing charges for misappropriation of marital funds, asset concealment, and fraud," I said evenly, "and I am serving him with divorce papers." Tom's head snapped up. His mouth opened like he was going to protest, but nothing came out. I remembered that look, panic wrestling with shame. I'd seen it before, the day I caught him lying about an overdraft, the night I found a receipt for a hotel he claimed he'd never been to. Except back then, I'd believed him when he said it was nothing. I'd believed because I needed to, because the alternative meant admitting I'd wasted decades on a man who'd never truly seen me. But now, standing here in this cold, sterile suite with a folder that could end him, I didn't need belief anymore. I needed truth, however ugly. The second officer stepped forward. "Mr. Hart," he said quietly, "we'll need you to come with us to provide a statement." Tom finally found his voice. "Wait, can we talk about this?" His eyes were shiny, his voice pitched too high. "Ellie, please, you don't understand." "Stop," I said, just above a whisper. He fell silent instantly, as if the command had pulled a string inside him. It was strange. The memories that surfaced unbidden. The day we signed the mortgage papers, his hand warm over mine as he promised we'd build a future. The night I sat on the edge of our bed, waiting for him to come home from what I'd convinced myself was just a late meeting. The birthdays he forgot. The apologies he rationed like precious resources. I realized in that moment that the woman I used to be had been grieving him for years before I ever knew the truth, and that grief had already turned into something sturdier, something that didn't flinch in the face of his pleading. The younger officer gently touched my elbow. "Would you like to step outside, Mrs. Hart?" I glanced around the suite, at the table set for two, the half-finished bottle of champagne, the crumpled dress on the arm of the sofa, and shook my head. "No," I said. "I'm fine right here." I wanted him to see me standing there, steady and unbowed. I wanted him to understand that everything he thought he could bury had finally clawed its way to the surface. Tom ran a hand over his mouth, and I watched his wedding band catch the light, a symbol so tarnished it felt almost obscene. His voice dropped to something smaller. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "We can fix it." I let out a breath, feeling something quiet and resolute settle in my bones. "You already did this," I said simply. And for the first time in the 37 years I'd known him, he had no answer. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was absolute. I don't know how long we stood there. Him in his borrowed robe, me in my black dress, the officers poised on either side like sentinels. The young woman had backed herself against the far wall, her eyes darting between us as though she was watching the slow-motion collapse of a building she'd assumed was structurally sound. I turned to the folder resting on the coffee table. My hands didn't shake when I flipped it open, revealing each sheet of paper I'd compiled in the nights he thought I was asleep. The first was a printout of our joint savings account, each withdrawal highlighted in yellow. $5,000 here, $12,000 there. The final transfer, $60,000 labeled as consulting fees, had posted less than a week ago. His eyes flicked to the page, then to me. "Ellie, what is this?" I almost laughed, as if he didn't recognize his own handwriting on the wire instructions, as if he thought I'd appear here with nothing but suspicions and wounded pride. "This," I said calmly, tapping the document, "is every lie you told with our names on the account." I turned the next page. Receipts from the hotel, room service, spa packages, jewelry. A dinner that cost more than the mortgage payment on the house we'd shared for 30 years. My gaze landed on the date at the top, our anniversary. I felt something inside me cool to an absolute zero. I didn't allow the grief in, not here, not in front of him. I placed the receipts aside and lifted the next document, a notarized letter from our accountant confirming the funds were jointly held. His face paled as he read the header. He opened his mouth, but the words must have died in his throat. Next came the travel itineraries, flight confirmations under his name. His signature, neat and familiar, stared back at him from the page. I remembered all those nights he'd texted, working late, and I'd believed him because belief was easier. The woman shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know he was married," she stammered, her voice cracking. I didn't look at her. "This isn't about you," I said evenly. "You owe me nothing." Because she didn't. She hadn't sworn any vows. She hadn't built a life on promises she never intended to keep. She was a symptom, not the cause. Tom's hands moved as if he could gather up the papers and erase them. He reached for the folder. One of the officers stepped forward, a quiet warning in his posture. "Sir, don't touch the evidence," the officer said firmly. Evidence. That word settled into the room like a final punctuation mark. For so long, my reality had felt slippery. I'd convinced myself I was overreacting, that I was paranoid, that a good wife didn't ask too many questions. But here it was, irrefutable. And seeing it all laid out so plainly, so neatly, didn't hurt the way I'd expected. If anything, it felt like relief. I pressed the divorce papers flat against the glass, aligning them with the edge of the table. My voice was steady as I spoke. "This is the petition for dissolution of marriage," I told him. "I'm not here to ask. I'm informing you." His breath rattled out of him. "Please, Ellie." I lifted my gaze, letting it rest on the lined skin of his face, the thinning hair, the sag of his shoulders. The man who once seemed larger than life looked small now, smaller than I'd ever seen him. "You drained our future to impress a stranger," I said quietly. "You spent the life we built like it was your birthright to waste, and you thought I'd be too old, too tired, too blind to see you." He flinched. I closed the folder and rested my palm on top of it, feeling the weight of every page, every lie. "But you forgot something," I continued. "I was here for all of it. I saw everything." The younger officer looked at me, respectful. "Ma'am, we're ready whenever you are." I took a deep breath. The air in the suite smelled of expensive soap and cold champagne. It smelled nothing like home. "Thank you," I said to the officer. And for the first time since this began, I realized that when I walked out of this room, I wouldn't be taking any of it with me. Not the shame, not the fear, not the question of whether I was enough. I'd leave all of it here, along with him. He was still talking when I turned away. I don't know what words he used. Maybe he was calling my name. Maybe he was weaving another excuse, another half-true story crafted to sound almost believable. But I'd stopped listening to him long before I stopped loving him, and by now, his voice was little more than an echo I no longer needed to interpret. The officers moved closer, one of them gently placing a hand on his arm. "Mr. Hart, we'll ask you to remain here while we take the initial statements," he said. The younger one gave me a careful nod. "Mrs. Hart, we can escort you downstairs if you prefer." "No," I said softly. "I'll see myself out." It felt important walking away on my own 2 feet. No assistance, no drama, just the quiet dignity he'd mistaken all these years for weakness. I picked up my bag from the console table, feeling the familiar weight settle against my shoulder. The last time I'd carried this bag was the day I sat in the attorney's office, listening as the accountant explained exactly how he'd siphoned money over years. Small withdrawals hidden inside larger transactions. I remembered how my hand had trembled then, how I'd felt old and stupid and used. But standing here in this suite he'd rented to celebrate his deceit, I didn't feel any of those things. I felt clean. I paused by the door, turning to look at him one final time. He was sitting now, perched on the edge of the sofa, head bowed, one hand covering his mouth, like he thought it could hold in everything spilling out. Shame, regret, fear. "Ellie, please," he murmured without lifting his gaze. I never meant—" I held up my hand. My wedding band caught the light, a glint of gold that felt cheap against the magnitude of what he'd done. "I don't need to hear it," I said. My voice was steady. "You've spent enough of my life telling me what you meant, what you didn't mean, what you couldn't help. I'm done parsing your intentions." He looked up, and for a moment I thought I saw the man I'd married. 30 years old, charming, so sure he could make me happy. But that man was long gone, and I'd spent too many years searching for him in a stranger's face. The young woman behind him finally spoke, her voice small. I didn't know about you." I believed her. She looked like someone who'd just realized she'd been living in a borrowed dream. She clutched the robe tighter around herself, eyes glossy. I inclined my head, gentle but final. "Then let this be your reminder," I said quietly. "If a man hides one life, he will eventually hide another." Her mouth opened, but no words came. She just nodded, swallowing whatever apology she thought she owed me. I turned back to Tom. My hand rested on the doorknob, the cool brass grounding me. "I want you to remember something," I said. "When you tell this story, and you will, I want you to remember that I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't break. I simply ended it." His shoulders folded inward as though he were bracing for impact. But the impact wasn't mine to deliver. That would come later, when the reality settled in that he'd lost more than money, more than reputation. He'd lost the woman who'd spent her life believing in him. I opened the door. The hallway was quiet, the soft carpet muffling every sound. As I stepped over the threshold, one of the officers offered a polite nod. I returned it, feeling something heavy slip off my shoulders. I didn't look back, not even once, because when you've seen the truth so clearly, you don't need to keep checking if it's still there. I walked down that hallway with my head high, the divorce papers in my bag, the proof of his betrayal in my hand, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that for the first time in my life, I was no longer defined by what he'd chosen to love instead of me. When the elevator doors slid open, I stepped inside, pressed the button for the lobby, and exhaled a breath I felt like I'd been holding for years. By the time the doors closed, I was already thinking about what came next. The elevator hummed as it descended. My reflection in the polished brass doors looked older than I felt. Lined cheeks, silver threads in my hair, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But beneath that, there was something else I hadn't seen in years, a steadiness that didn't depend on anyone else's permission. When the doors opened, the lobby was hushed in that way expensive places often are. Voices softened to a murmur, everything designed to reassure guests that nothing messy ever happens here. But they were wrong. The mess had happened on the 18th floor. I walked past the concierge desk without a glance. The young man behind it, who'd watched me walk in with 2 police officers, lowered his eyes. Maybe he pitied me. Maybe he admired me. I didn't care. Outside, the city air hit my skin, cooler than I expected. It felt good, like the first lungful after a long confinement. I stepped to the curb and wrapped my arms around myself, not out of weakness, but to feel the solid shape of my own body, to remind myself that I still existed without him. A cab pulled up. The driver, a woman about my age, leaned across the seat and smiled kindly. "Need a ride?" I nodded and climbed in, feeling the weight of the folder in my lap as if it were an anchor I'd finally decided to let go of. "Rough day?" she asked, gently as she pulled away from the curb. I considered lying, saying something small, but the truth felt cleaner. "The end of a marriage," I said. She glanced at me in the rear-view mirror. "Then maybe it's also the start of something better." I didn't reply, but I held her gaze for a moment longer than was polite. There was something in her eyes, something that said she'd been through her own reckonings. Maybe we all have sooner or later. The city drifted by in a blur of lights and motion. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was chasing anything. His approval and explanation, the fantasy of a life that had never really existed. I rested my hand on the folder and closed my eyes. I thought I might feel triumphant, vindicated, but the feeling was simpler than that, just an immense, echoing quiet. When I got home, the house felt different. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It was pure. No hidden resentments, no half-truths folded into polite conversation, just the click of my heels on the tile, the familiar scent of lemon oil from the counters I'd wiped down that morning. I set the folder on the kitchen table and stood over it. For years, I'd been the one cataloging our life, filing bills, recording birthdays, saving receipts. I thought it was my way of keeping us together. But now, looking at the evidence, I realized I'd been documenting my own erasure. I flipped the folder open one last time. The first page was the bank statement with all the highlighted withdrawals, yellow lines marking every moment he chose himself over me. I felt a small ache in my chest, but it wasn't grief. It was something closer to acceptance. With slow, deliberate movements, I took the pages out and fed them into the shredder, one by one. Not to erase the truth, he'd done that enough for both of us, but because I didn't need the proof anymore. The truth had already built itself into the foundation of who I was becoming. When the last page disappeared into confetti, I closed the shredder and set my palms on the counter. The house was still, but it didn't feel empty. I turned on the radio, an old jazz station he'd always complained about. The saxophone filled the kitchen, warm and low. I made myself a cup of tea, measuring the sugar exactly the way I liked it, 3/4 of a teaspoon. Not the full spoon he always insisted was better. And I stood there in my kitchen, in my quiet house, listening to music he'd never liked, drinking tea he'd never bothered to make for me, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The next morning, I woke before dawn. For a moment, in that gray hour before the sun fully rises, I forgot everything. My body moved on old muscle memory, reach for his side of the bed, listen for the kettle whistling from the kitchen. But the space beside me was cold, undisturbed, and the house was silent in a way that wasn't waiting for anything. I sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my joints, the dull ache behind my eyes from too little sleep. There was a time that kind of emptiness would have terrified me, but as I sat on the edge of the bed, I realized I wasn't afraid. I was unburdened. It's a strange thing to feel light after decades of carrying someone else's expectations, to realize that every compromise you made, every piece of yourself you set aside, hadn't actually bought you the security you thought it would. I pulled the quilt around my shoulders and walked through the house, touching the backs of chairs, the corners of tables, reacquainting myself with this place that had become a museum to someone else's comfort. When I reached the spare bedroom, the one we'd always said we'd turn into a study, I stood in the doorway a long time. We'd never bothered to finish it. For years, it had been a storage space, the door always half closed, as though even the room itself was waiting for permission to become something. I switched on the light. Dust motes danced in the beam. The boxes were still stacked against the walls. Old tax records, Christmas decorations, photo albums we hadn't opened in years. I pulled one down, brushing off the lid, and lifted out a picture. We were young. God, so young. Smiling into the sun on a pier somewhere I couldn't remember anymore. He had his arm around my waist, his grin wide, certain. I studied my own face in the photo. My eyes were soft, trusting. I looked like someone who hadn't yet learned the difference between love and possession. I laid the photo back in the box and closed the lid. This room doesn't have to stay a monument to what never was, I thought. So I started clearing it, one box at a time, methodical and deliberate. The shredder whirred again as I fed it old receipts, obsolete bills, traces of a life I no longer owed stewardship. What I couldn't shred, I packed for donation. What I couldn't donate, I carried to the curb. By mid-afternoon, the space was empty except for the light pooling across the bare floor. I stood in the center, feeling my heartbeat, slow and steady. Then I went online and ordered a desk. A simple one, pale wood, nothing ornate. A chair that looked comfortable enough to sit in for hours. A small rug in a bright pattern. I'd always wanted a place to write. I'd told him that once. He'd laughed and said, "You don't need a whole room to jot grocery lists." But I wasn't jotting grocery lists anymore. When the order was confirmed, I closed the laptop and stood there for a long moment, hands at my sides. For the first time in decades, I felt a flicker of curiosity about my own future. I made a pot of soup that evening, not the bland vegetable stew he liked, but something richer, spiced lentils, garlic, a swirl of cream. I set the table for one. Cloth napkin, my favorite bowl, a glass of the good red wine he'd always insisted we save for special occasions. It was a Tuesday, but it felt special enough to me. I ate slowly, savoring each bite. The radio played Billie Holiday, and I let the sound fill all the spaces he used to occupy. When the dishes were done, I lit a candle in the middle of the table, just because I wanted the light. It flickered gently against the walls, casting the whole kitchen in a warm glow. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't the end of my life. It was just the end of being defined by someone else's. And in that small, golden room, with no witnesses but my own reflection in the window, I let myself smile. The next morning, the phone rang. For a moment, my old reflex kicked in. I almost reached for it with the same hope that used to grip me whenever he was late, whenever he disappeared for a weekend, with an excuse so thin I'd have to squint to pretend it was true. But this time, I didn't hurry to answer. I didn't feel the familiar twinge of dread. I let it ring until the machine picked up. His voice still recorded there, warm and confident in the way only the undeserving can be. "You've reached Tom and Ellie. Leave a message." I wondered if she'd hear that greeting someday, the girl from the hotel suite, and realize she'd never been the only one. Maybe she already had. The beep sounded, and then silence. No message. I waited a beat longer, then unplugged the phone from the wall. The house felt lighter without its insistence. I carried the old handset to the kitchen trash and set it gently on top of a nest of shredded papers. It didn't feel ceremonial. It felt practical, the way you discard any tool that no longer serves its purpose. The mail came around 11. I sorted through it at the kitchen counter, an electric bill, a catalog, a letter from my lawyer confirming receipt of my signed divorce papers. I opened that one last. The language was cold, professional. Please find enclosed the acknowledgement of service. But I didn't mind. I'd had enough sentiment to last me a lifetime. I folded the letter back into its envelope and slipped it into a drawer. A thought came to me then, as clear as the morning light spilling across the sink. I didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore. Not his family, who'd always looked at me like I'd won some unearned prize. Not the neighbors, who would pretend to be surprised but had surely seen the signs. Not even him. Especially not him. The ache in my chest eased, replaced by something I didn't recognize right away. It took me a moment to name it. Possibility. I made myself another cup of tea and took it to the back porch, where the marigolds I'd planted last spring were already blooming. They glowed a rich, stubborn orange, like they'd never considered not surviving the winter. I sat in the old wicker chair and wrapped my hands around the warm mug. For the first time in months, I wasn't replaying what I should have said in that hotel suite. I wasn't wondering if he'd call. I was thinking about what I might plant next year, about the color I wanted to paint the spare bedroom when the furniture arrived, about whether I'd finally take that train trip up the coast alone, the way I'd always promised myself I would. The phone didn't ring again that day. Neither did my mobile, which I'd switched back on after weeks of silence. He didn't try to call me. And instead of feeling abandoned, I felt something close to freedom. I sat in the quiet until dusk fell, the light softening to a gray that held no menace, no threat. When I went back inside, the house greeted me with the hush of a place that was finally, truly my own. I didn't lock the door behind me because I wasn't afraid anymore. And in that small act, leaving the entrance open to the night, I felt more powerful than I ever had in all the years I'd spent guarding a marriage that was never worthy of my faith. 3 days later, he came to the house. I was in the kitchen, folding a fresh stack of dish towels when I saw his silhouette blur across the frosted glass of the front door. For a moment, just a moment, I felt that old pull in my chest, the reflex to smooth my hair, to brace for the familiar, rehearsed apology. But I didn't move to open the door. I stood there, my hands resting on the folded towels, and watched as his outline shifted nervously, hesitated, then raised an arm to knock. 3 measured raps, just like the ones I'd made at the hotel suite. I almost smiled at the symmetry of it. When I finally opened the door, he looked smaller, older. His face was lined in a way I hadn't noticed, or maybe I'd simply stopped seeing it after so many years of believing he was someone he wasn't. He was holding a cardboard box, taped shut, corners soft from handling. "Ellie," he started, voice rasping. I didn't let him finish. "Don't come in," I said, gentle but final. He swallowed, his throat working around words he seemed to realize would find no purchase here. I thought you should have these." He lifted the box a fraction higher. I didn't ask what was inside. I knew. Keepsakes he could no longer bear to keep. Maybe the wedding album. Maybe the letters I'd written him decades ago when he was traveling for work, and I still believed that distance was the worst thing that could happen to us. I looked at the box, then back at him. "Leave it on the porch," I said. He did. Slowly, like the weight of it was more than he'd expected. "I'm sorry," he whispered when he straightened. I nodded once. Not to forgive him, because forgiveness wasn't something I owed him anymore, but to acknowledge that at least he'd spoken the word. "You didn't have to come here," I said, my voice calm. "I don't need anything from you." His eyes shone with something that might have been grief, or self-pity, or the realization that he'd underestimated me so completely that he hadn't even imagined this outcome, that I would stand here, unbroken, unwilling to let him across the threshold again. I didn't think it would end like this," he murmured. I felt a flicker of something. Regret, perhaps, for all the years we'd spent together, all the plans we'd made that had withered in the darkness of his secrecy. But the feeling passed as quickly as it came. "Neither did I said softly. "But here we are." He looked down at the box as though it might offer him an answer, some script to follow that could repair what he'd shattered. But there was no script. When he finally lifted his gaze to mine, I saw that he understood. "Goodbye, Tom," I said. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he turned and walked back to his car. He didn't look back. I watched him drive away, the taillights winking red as he rounded the corner and disappeared. I stood in the doorway a moment longer, feeling the cool breeze against my face. Then I bent and picked up the box, carrying it into the living room. I set it on the coffee table but didn't open it right away. Instead, I sat down in the chair by the window, the one he never liked because it faced the street. I'd always loved it, loved the way the morning sun poured across the cushions, loved the view of the neighbors' flower beds blooming in absurd, cheerful defiance of every disappointment. I watched the wind move through the branches, listened to the hush of my own house, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt no urge to fill the silence. I didn't open the box that day. I left it on the coffee table, the way you might leave a letter whose contents you already know by heart. There was no urgency, no curiosity left to soothe, only the quiet understanding that what was in that box belonged to another life. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the house, not out of obligation, but because it felt like claiming each room for myself. The vacuum humming over the carpets, the rag wiping away fingerprints that weren't mine. It was a small, necessary ritual. When the sun dipped low behind the trees, I made a simple supper, a bowl of tomato soup, a thick slice of bread, buttered just the way I liked. I ate at the kitchen table with the window cracked open to let in the cool air. Afterward, I carried my plate to the sink, washed it slowly, and set it in the drying rack. I felt the heaviness of exhaustion, but it wasn't the draining kind that came from worry. It was the kind that follows relief. Later, when the moon was high, I turned off every light except the lamp in the living room. Its circle of warm gold fell across the box. I thought, briefly, that I should look through it, make some gesture of closure, whatever that meant. But the thought passed, and I let it. Closure wasn't in those artifacts. It wasn't in the photos, the cards, the faded ticket stubs he'd saved when it suited his nostalgia. Closure was here, in the hush of this house that no longer felt like a museum of our failures. I went to bed early, the night air slipping across my face as I pulled the quilt to my shoulders. For a while, I lay awake, watching the shadows shift on the ceiling. My mind wandered to places it hadn't dared to in years. What if I traveled? What if I learned something new? What if the next chapter didn't require an apology to begin? I remembered the train trip I'd always talked about taking up the coast. He used to laugh when I mentioned it. Too cold, he'd say. Too much trouble. But the trouble, I was starting to understand, was never really the train. It was the idea that I might want something for myself. I reached for the small notebook I kept in the drawer beside the bed, the one I hadn't written in for years. I flipped past old lists, groceries, bills, reminders to pick up his prescriptions, and found a blank page. At the top, I wrote, "Plans just for me." The words looked strange at first, selfish almost, but as I stared at them, they began to look more like a promise. I made my first list. Take the train north in the fall, repaint the spare room, host dinner for friends without explaining why, learn to grow something I can't kill, maybe lavender, sit by the sea and read a book with no phone in reach. I closed the notebook and set it on the nightstand. My hand lingered on the cover, as though steadying myself for the idea that this small, unassuming ledger was where my real life might begin. When I turned out the lamp, the darkness wasn't frightening. It was open, endless, waiting. I lay there a long time, breathing the quiet, until the softest smile found its way to my mouth. He was gone. But I was still here. And for the first time in a long, long while, that felt like enough. I woke before dawn the next day. It wasn't the old restlessness that stirred me. No phantom footsteps in the hallway, no subconscious flinch expecting to hear the front door creak as he slipped in at some indecent hour. This time, I woke because I wanted to, because there was a sunrise waiting that didn't care whether I was alone. I padded through the house barefoot, each step soft on the cool hardwood. When I passed the coffee table, the box was still there, but it no longer felt like an accusation, just a relic, a sealed archive of a history that would never again dictate who I had to be. I didn't touch it. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, set the kettle on the stove, and pulled open the curtains. Pale pink light was already spreading across the yard, illuminating the marigolds I'd planted. They seemed to glow in the half-light. Defiant, bright, unconcerned. I poured a mug of coffee and sat by the back door. For years, I'd never bothered to sit here in the mornings. He didn't like the chill, didn't like the view of the neighbors' fences, said it made the house look small. Funny how it took his absence for me to realize I liked the fences. They felt honest. Boundaries marked plainly, no pretense about which space belonged to whom. I sipped the coffee slowly, letting the heat fill the hollow places he'd left behind. When the sun crested the roof lines, I stood and walked to the spare room. The empty floor gleamed, dustless and bare. The walls looked almost expectant, as if they too were ready to become something more. I thought of all the years I'd waited for permission to claim even a corner for myself. How many times had I deferred my own needs so he wouldn't feel inconvenienced? How often had I told myself it was easier not to ask? But easier doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means smaller. I opened the notebook I'd left on the kitchen counter and turned to my list. Plans just for me. I ran my finger under the first line. Take the train north in the fall. And felt a flicker of something almost shy. Hope, maybe. Or anticipation. He'd spent years convincing me I was too cautious, too practical, too set in my ways to want anything bigger. But the truth was simpler. He needed me small so he wouldn't have to grow. I didn't need that anymore. Before I could talk myself out of it, I picked up the phone and called the travel agent whose number I'd saved months ago but never dared to dial. "Hi," I said when the line connected. My voice was steadier than I expected. "I'd like to book a train ticket." The woman on the other end sounded cheerful, efficient. "Of course, where to?" I looked out the window at the morning sky, watched a bird land on the fence, light and certain. "Anywhere north," I said, and surprised myself by laughing softly. "Somewhere I've never been." She started rattling off options, departure times, seat classes, fares, but none of it felt overwhelming. It felt like possibility. When we finished the booking, I thanked her, hung up the phone, and set it back in its cradle. I stood there for a moment, palms pressed flat against the counter, feeling my pulse move steady and unhurried through my veins. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, something deeper. It was the understanding that even after everything he'd taken, my faith, my money, my time, I still had this, the right to my own beginning. I spent the next few days in motion. Not the frantic, grasping motion of survival, but the deliberate, unhurried kind, like I was moving through the rooms of my own life and finally seeing what belonged and what never had. I boxed up the last of his things, the cufflinks he never wore, the books he insisted we display but never read, the framed photo from our 25th anniversary dinner that I'd once thought captured happiness. Looking at it now, I could see all the cracks, the way his smile had never quite reached his eyes, the way my hand rested on his arm more out of duty than love. I set the photo face down in the box. When I taped it shut, I didn't feel grief, just relief. That afternoon, I carried the box to the garage. I'd call a courier to collect it eventually, but there was no rush. Nothing inside it was urgent anymore. I returned to the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of tea. My movements were slow, measured, each small action a reminder that this house no longer needed to be curated to anyone else's preferences. No more bland dinners to avoid complaints, no more television droning through every meal, no more polite silences to keep the peace. I set the cup down and noticed how the steam curled in the afternoon light, soft and rising in a silver ribbon. I thought about all the years I'd convinced myself that love was supposed to be complicated, that if I just worked harder, gave more, accepted less, eventually it would feel right. It never had. And here, finally, was the proof that my instincts had always been trying to save me. Late that evening, I heard a knock at the door. My heart didn't lurch the way it once would have. I opened it to find my neighbor Rose standing there with a casserole dish wrapped in a towel. She was my age, maybe older, her hair pinned back in the same practical style I'd always admired. "I thought you might not feel like cooking," she said simply. I didn't tell her I'd already eaten. I didn't protest that I was fine. I just stepped back and gestured her inside. She set the dish on the counter and turned to face me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached out and took my hand. Her palm was warm, her fingers dry and strong. "I know what it's like," she said softly. I nodded, feeling my throat tighten, though no tears came. "I know," I whispered back. We stood there like that for a moment. Two women who had survived men who mistook their devotion for weakness. When she finally left, I walked her to the door and hugged her longer than I'd planned. After she was gone, I carried the casserole to the kitchen table and set it down. I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt witnessed. And I realized that was all I'd ever really needed. Not validation, not permission, not some grand gesture of apology. Just for someone to look at me and see the truth I'd been carrying alone for too long. That night, I sat in the living room with a pen and my small blue notebook. I turned to the last blank page and wrote in careful script, "Today I began again." I closed the cover, smoothed my hand over it, and set it on the arm of the chair. When I turned out the lamp, the darkness felt honest. Nothing hidden, nothing denied. Just the quiet of a house that was finally truly mine. The morning after Rose came by, I woke to sunlight filtering through the curtains, warm, unhurried. For the first time in years, there was no dread in my chest as I opened my eyes. No question about where he'd been. No waiting for the apology that would never come. I lay there a while, listening to the quiet. I thought about the night I'd walked into that hotel suite with my folder of evidence and the two officers behind me. How he'd looked up at me, pale, slack-jawed. like he'd just seen the ghost of the woman he'd convinced himself was too timid to ever hold him accountable. I hadn't felt like a ghost then. I'd felt like a reckoning. When I finally got up, I pulled on a sweater and padded into the kitchen. The counter was still dusted with a little flour from the bread I'd baked the night before. He'd always insisted homemade bread was too much work. I smiled to myself, running a hand over the smooth wooden surface, as if to remind it, and myself, that no effort spent on my own joy was ever wasted. The phone was blinking, a voicemail. For a moment, my stomach tightened, the old reflex trying to return. But then I exhaled, long and slow. I pressed play. "Ellie, it's Tom." His voice was brittle, smaller somehow. "I know you probably won't listen to this, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I don't know why I did what I did. Maybe you were too good for me. Maybe I pressed delete before he could finish. I didn't need his reasons. When you spend decades twisting yourself into a shape that will fit someone else's small idea of you, the real apology isn't theirs to give. It's yours to claim. I turned on the radio, jazz this time, and let the music fill the kitchen as I cracked 2 eggs into a skillet. While the breakfast cooked, I took my notebook from the table and flipped back to the list of plans I'd started. One by one, I read them aloud. Take the train north in the fall. Repaint the spare room, host dinner for friends without explaining why, grow something I can't kill, sit by the sea and read a book with no phone in reach. I set my palm over the words. I'd spent so many years thinking life would begin when he finally loved me the way I needed, when he chose me without resentment, without hesitation. But life wasn't waiting on the other side of his affection. It was waiting right here, in the small rituals of my own choosing. When the eggs were done, I slid them onto a plate and sat at the table. No second setting, no empty chair across from me to remind me of what I'd lost. Just me. And the knowledge that nothing about this morning felt like lack. After I ate, I went out to the garden and knelt in the soil. The marigolds were still thriving, unapologetically bright. I loosened the dirt where the old roots had died, making space for something new to take hold. I didn't know yet what I'd plant there, but for the first time, I was certain it would be something that was mine alone. The sun rose higher, warming my back, and I closed my eyes, letting the light soak through me. I was 65 years old, and finally, irrevocably, I belonged to no one but myself. I didn't leave the garden until the afternoon had turned the sky a soft, bleached blue. My knees were damp with soil and my palms were streaked with dirt. I didn't care. It felt good to be messy for once, to have evidence on my skin that I'd spent a morning tending something alive, something that asked nothing of me but my time and my care. When I finally went back inside, the house was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that made me feel invisible. It was the good kind, the kind that let me hear my own thoughts without interruption. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, watching the dirt swirl away. I thought of all the hours I'd spent scrubbing counters before he came home, trying to make everything perfect so he would have nothing to criticize. I didn't do that anymore. I'd stopped believing that love was something you earned by disappearing into someone else's comfort. I dried my hands and walked to the spare bedroom. The delivery had come while I was outside. My new desk sat in the middle of the floor, wrapped in cardboard and foam. I tore the packaging open piece by piece, each rip of tape feeling like another small declaration. I am allowed to want things. When it was unwrapped, I stood back to look at it. Pale wood, clean lines, a blank surface waiting for whatever I decided to create. I set my notebook on it, then the new pen I'd bought just for this purpose. No shopping list scribbles this time, no reminders for errands he'd never thank me for running. Only the promise that whatever words I wrote next would be my own. That evening, I made dinner with no recipe, just whatever I felt like throwing in the pot. I played my records, Etta James, Van Morrison, even the old Simon and Garfunkel album he always said sounded like whining. I sang along as I chopped onions loud and off-key and felt no need to apologize. After I ate, I lit a candle on the coffee table. The box he'd left me still sat there, unopened. I studied it for a moment, considering whether I wanted to sift through its contents after all. But the truth was, I didn't need to. There was nothing in there that could change what had happened or who I was becoming without him. So I carried the box to the garage, set it on a high shelf, and turned off the light. Maybe I'd look through it one day. Maybe I wouldn't. Either way, it didn't get to sit in the middle of my living room anymore, taking up space that belonged to better things. When I came back inside, I poured a glass of wine and curled up in the armchair by the window. The house was dark except for the pool of lamplight around me. Outside, the street was quiet. I sipped the wine and opened my notebook again. At the top of a clean page, I wrote, "I am not what he left behind. I am what I chose to save." The words made my throat tighten, but I didn't look away. I read them again, slower this time, letting them sink into the soft places that had once believed I needed his approval to feel real. I closed the book and sat there breathing until the moon rose over the rooftops. In that quiet, I felt something settle, a calm so complete it almost frightened me. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for him to explain, not for the past to make sense, not for the grief to vanish before I started living again. I was already living, and it was enough. I woke up the next morning without an alarm. The light was soft and clear across the quilt, the way it is when the seasons first start to change. For a moment, I just lay there, watching the pale gold creep across the walls, and felt the unfamiliar weightlessness of a life no longer tethered to someone else's expectations. I didn't think about him. I didn't wonder if he was alone or if he'd found someone else to fill the silence I'd left behind. I thought about the train ticket folded neatly in my purse, about the garden waiting for me to plant something new, about the desk in the spare room, empty and patient, like it knew I'd find the right words when I was ready. I got up slowly, feeling each part of my body wake, shoulders, knees, hands. These hands that had carried his burdens for so long, these hands that had packed his suitcase and signed the divorce papers, these hands that now belonged entirely to me. I showered and dressed without hurry. When I looked in the mirror, I saw the lines around my eyes, the silver streaking through my hair, and felt nothing but tenderness for the woman reflected there. She had stayed too long. She had loved too hard. But she had also survived, and she had walked out of a hotel suite with her head high, carrying her own salvation in a plain manila folder. Downstairs, the house was still. But the silence wasn't empty. It was spacious. I made coffee and took it to the kitchen table, where the first warm sunbeams pooled across the wood. I opened my notebook and ran my fingertips over the last thing I'd written. I am not what he left behind. I am what I chose to save. I turned to a fresh page, and this time I didn't hesitate. I started a list, not of chores or obligations or ways to make myself smaller so someone else could feel big. A list of things that belonged only to me. Places I want to go. Lisbon, Edinburgh, that small town on the coast with the lighthouse. Things I want to learn. How to grow lavender. How to speak enough Spanish to order breakfast without apology. How to be alone without feeling lonely. Things I will never do again. Pretend I don't see the truth. Believe that love requires erasing myself. Wait to be chosen. I set the pen down and read the list twice. My chest tightened, but it wasn't pain. It was something like relief. After I closed the notebook, I pulled on my coat and stepped outside. The day was bright and brisk. The air full of the first hints of autumn. I walked slowly to the end of the block. When I turned back, the house looked different. Smaller, maybe. Or maybe it was just that. For the first time, I wasn't looking at it as the place I'd kept someone else's life afloat. It was my house now. My quiet. My clean slate. When I went back inside, I set the kettle to boil. I poured a second cup of tea, not for him, not for anyone else, but because I wanted it. And as I stood there, in my kitchen, in my life, I thought, this is what freedom looks like. Not a dramatic ending, not a single moment when everything becomes clear, but the slow, patient work of becoming someone who doesn't ask for permission to matter. I carried my tea to the desk in the spare room and sat down. Outside, the day unfolded without expectation. And inside, so did I.